The transmission came in the middle of the night, and nobody on Earth was ready for it. Colonel Aaron Briggs was sitting in a small office at the Earth Defense Command Base in Nevada when the message arrived. He was drinking cold coffee and reading an old report about the Oran Belt boundary dispute. The dispute had been going on for weeks. Most people in his building thought it would blow over. Aaron was not so sure. The message was from Commander Zrath of the Vrethkai Empire. It was short. It was cold. It said that humanity had violated sacred Vrethkai territory in the Oran Belt, and that all diplomatic options were now closed. At the bottom of the message, almost like a joke, Zrath had written a single line. It read, "Congratulations. You have just warred humanity." Aaron read it 3 times. He set the paper down on his desk very slowly. Then he looked across the room at his second-in-command, Lieutenant Diane Hollis, who had just walked in with a fresh cup of coffee and a confused look on her face. She saw his expression and stopped walking. She said, "What happened?" He slid the paper toward her across the desk. She read it. Her eyebrows went up slowly, and then she looked at him, and then she looked back at the paper. She said, "They think this is funny." He said, "Yes, they do." The Vrethkai were not a species that laughed often. They were ancient, powerful, and deeply serious. They had been fighting wars across the galaxy for over 4,000 years, and they had never lost one. Not once. Their record was perfect, and they were very proud of that fact. When they decided to destroy something, they destroyed it. When they decided to conquer someone, that someone was conquered. It was that simple for them. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 30 years. In galactic terms, that was nothing. Earth was considered a minor species, young and noisy and not particularly dangerous. The Galactic Council had accepted humanity mostly because ignoring them seemed like more trouble than it was worth. Ambassador Leon Farrow had done his best. He was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes, and he had spent years building small friendships with other species on the Galactic Council. When the Vrethkai filed their official accusation against Earth, Leon stood up in the council chamber and gave a calm and respectful speech. He apologized for the boundary confusion. He offered reparations. He asked for a chance to discuss the matter in good faith. The council chamber was quiet when he finished. Then several of the older representatives began to murmur among themselves. And then, slowly, the Vrethkai representative stood up. He was a large creature, dark-scaled, with eyes like flat black stones. He looked at Leon for a long moment. Then he said that the apology had been noted. He said it had been rejected. He said the Vrethkai fleet was already moving and that humanity had 48 hours to prepare itself for what was coming. Leon stood very still. He did not raise his voice. He said, "On behalf of Earth, we ask one final time for peaceful resolution." The Vrethkai representative turned and walked out of the chamber without responding. Back on Earth, Aaron was already pulling up star maps and fleet positions. Diane stood beside him, quiet and focused. The base was coming alive around them, lights turning on in hallways, boots on hard floors, voices rising and then going calm again as officers found their posts. A young communications officer knocked on the open door. He said, "Sir, we have confirmed Vrethkai fleet movement in sectors 7 and 9. They are not slowing down." Aaron nodded. He picked up the Zrath message one more time and read it again. Then he folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. Diane asked, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I want to show them what that phrase means." She said, "Which phrase?" He said, "The one they thought was a joke." Outside the window, the Nevada desert was dark and silent under a sky full of stars. Somewhere out among those stars, a fleet of ships that had never lost a war was coming toward them. The Vrethkai had given humanity 48 hours. Aaron Briggs did not plan to spend any of that time being afraid. The first strike came at dawn, Earth time, and it was devastating. 3 human outposts near the Oran Belt were hit within minutes of each other. The strikes were precise, clean, and total. There was no warning and no chance to run. The Vrethkai did not waste shots. They never had. By the time Earth's long-range sensors confirmed what had happened, the outposts were already gone. Galactic observers watching from neutral stations began placing bets. Most of them agreed humanity would broadcast a surrender message within 72 hours. It was the logical thing to do. The Vrethkai had never been stopped in 4,000 years. There was no reason to think a young species with 30 years of galactic experience would be any different. They waited for the surrender message. It did not come. Instead, Earth's main news channels started airing old war documentaries. History programs about ancient conflicts on their home world, battles that went on for years, soldiers who kept going through things that should have broken them. In the streets of major cities, people gathered in large groups. They were not panicking. They were loud and angry, and somehow, in a way the Vrethkai Intelligence Division could not quite explain, they seemed energized. Commander Zrath received the behavior report on his flagship and read it twice. Then he sent it back to his analysts and told them to check their data. They checked it. The data was correct. He sat with that for a long time. Out in the Oran Belt, Lieutenant Diane Hollis was not waiting for anyone's permission to act. She had pulled together a small group of ships, mostly retrofitted mining vessels with defense plating bolted on and weapons that had never been tested in real combat. Her crew was nervous. She was not. She had been studying Vrethkai battle records for the past 18 hours. They were brilliant fighters. They moved in perfect formations, used layered tactics, and never left gaps in their lines. They were so good at fighting the right way that Diane had started to wonder what would happen if someone fought the completely wrong way. She found out when she led her small group into the debris field on the edge of Sector 7. The Vrethkai supply convoy was moving through that sector on a standard route. No experienced commander would have tried to stop it with mining ships. The debris field was unstable and the angles were all wrong. Diane used the angles anyway. She flew her ships through gaps that were barely wide enough, used the spinning debris as cover, and collapsed 3 large rock formations directly onto the convoy's flanking ships using nothing but gravity assists and timing. The convoy lost 6 support vessels in 4 minutes. The rest scattered. The forward battalion they were supplying was suddenly cut off. When the engagement report reached Aaron back at Earth Command, he stared at it for a moment and then said, quietly, "That is not how that is supposed to work." The officer beside him said, "No, sir, it is not." Aaron said, "Good." Dr. Nina Caswell was not a soldier. She was a xenobiologist who had spent 12 years studying alien species for the Earth Science Division, and she had been attached to the fleet mostly because someone thought her knowledge of alien biology might help with medical planning. What nobody had expected was that she would spend her first week of the war reading every piece of Vrethkai battle data she could find and coming to a conclusion that changed how Aaron thought about the entire conflict. She sent him a message at 2 in the morning. It said, "They fight in perfect logical patterns. Every move follows a rule. They have never in 4,000 years faced an enemy that uses chaos as a method. They do not know how to model it. They do not have a word for it in their military language." Aaron read the message. He read it again. He forwarded it to Diane with a single line attached. It said, "Keep doing what you are doing." On a damaged relay station in Sector 9, Corporal Kevin Marsh was alone. The station had taken a hit early in the fighting and most of the crew had evacuated. Kevin had stayed because the communications relay was still functioning and the fleet needed it to stay that way. He had a small weapon, 3 days of food, and a room full of automated drones that the Vrethkai kept sending to finish the job. He held the station for 31 hours. When the relief team finally reached him and asked why he had not retreated, he looked at them with red eyes and said, "Nobody told me to stop." The Galactic Council, watching all of this with growing discomfort, sent a mediator ship toward Earth. The message attached to it offered neutral ground for ceasefire talks. It was a generous offer. Most species in humanity's position would have accepted it immediately. Earth declined politely. In the neutral observation stations, species that had been watching with casual interest began watching more carefully. The bets about a 72-hour surrender had already been lost. New bets were being placed, but nobody was quite sure what to bet on anymore. Zrath stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the star map for a long time. The human fleet should have been broken by now. The numbers said it should have been broken. The history of every war he had ever studied said it should have been broken. He asked his intelligence officer how long humans had been fighting wars on their own planet before they reached space. The officer checked the records and said, "Approximately 10,000 years, Commander. With very few extended periods of total peace." Zrath said nothing. He looked at the star map for a while longer. Then he said, "Show me everything we have on their history." The screen filled with data. He began to read. 6 months into the war, the Vrethkai had taken territory. They had pushed humanity back in 3 sectors and destroyed a significant portion of Earth's outer defense line. By every measurement that had ever mattered in galactic warfare, they were winning. And yet they could not finish it. The galactic observers who had predicted a quick human surrender were now updating their reports with careful, confused language. They used phrases like unexpected endurance and atypical morale patterns. One senior analyst wrote simply that the humans did not appear to understand that they were losing, and that this was creating serious problems for standard predictive models. What the analysts did not know, and what the Vrethkai were only starting to understand, was that something had happened on Earth in the first weeks of the war. The conflict had become personal for almost every human alive. It was not just a military matter. It had become part of who they were. Songs were being written about specific battles. Unit patches were being collected by civilians back home. Children were drawing pictures of the fights. There were jokes about the Vrethkai in every language on the planet, and the jokes were not afraid. They were sharp and loud and full of something that was hard to translate but felt very much like defiance. General Aaron Briggs, promoted 3 months into the war, was coordinating a campaign across multiple star systems from the bridge of his flagship, the Ardent. He had not slept more than 5 hours in any single night since the war began. He looked like it. He did not complain about it. Diane Hollis, now leading her own division called the Phantom Division, had become something close to a legend among the human fleet. Her unit was built entirely on speed and misdirection. They hit things where they were not supposed to be and disappeared before the Vrethkai could respond. They had started making strikes so unpredictable in timing and location that Vrethkai commanders were defending positions that Diane had never intended to hit, wasting resources on ghosts. Commander Zrath had started studying human history in his private hours. He had read about the 100 Years' War, a conflict between 2 human nations that lasted over a century. He had read about the 30 Years' War. He had read about a Cold War that lasted decades with no direct fighting at all, just pressure and waiting and preparation. He had read about a small nation that had been attacked by a much larger force and simply refused to fall, year after year, until the larger force grew tired and stopped. He had submitted a report to the Vrethkai High Council. In the report, he said that he believed Earth had never had a long period of peace in its recorded history, and that this meant their population had cultural structures built around enduring conflict that no species in the galaxy had ever developed, because no other species had needed them. The High Council responded by sending him reinforcements and telling him to end the war quickly. Pilot Gary Elliott was not famous before the war. He was a veteran with a scarred chin and a habit of making bad jokes at the worst possible moments, and his squadron, which the crew had named the Bent Nails, had a reputation for surviving things they should not have survived. The Battle of the Kaldis Drift lasted 3 days. The Vrethkai had sent a large carrier fleet to secure a critical refueling position in the drift. If they held it, they could push deep into the inner sectors and put real pressure on Earth's core systems. Aaron needed that carrier fleet occupied long enough for his main force to move. He called Gary. Gary and the Bent Nails took on the carrier fleet with 7 ships. They did not try to win. They tried to be annoying, which they were very good at. They attacked from bad angles, retreated in strange directions, came back from places that made no tactical sense, and generally behaved in a way that forced the Vrethkai carrier fleet to respond to them instead of moving forward. They held them for 3 days. Aaron reclaimed the Oran Belt. The Bent Nails lost 4 ships. Gary came back with his remaining 3 and landed on the deck of the Ardent looking like he had aged 10 years. Aaron met him there. He did not say anything about the losses. He said, "You held long enough." Gary said, "We always hold long enough. That is what Bent Nails do. You cannot pull them out easy." Aaron gave a public address to Earth around the 5-month mark. He stood in front of a camera in a small room on the Ardent, with no prepared notes. He did not say they were going to win. He did not promise a quick end. He said only that they were not stopping, and that was all he had to tell them. It was shared more than any other broadcast in human history up to that point. Zrath watched the broadcast on a captured human communication device. He watched it 3 times. Then he looked out at the stars through the viewport of his ship and thought about the 100 Years' War, and the Cold War, and the small nation that would not fall. He thought, "We have been in this war for 6 months. Humans had fought wars on their own planet that lasted 100 years. He sat with that thought for a very long time. 1 year into the war, both sides had taken serious losses. Earth had lost ships, stations, and soldiers in numbers that nobody had wanted to count out loud at first. The Vrethkai had lost more than they had expected to lose, and their economy, built around a war machine that usually ended conflicts quickly, was beginning to feel the strain. The galactic community watched with growing unease. Several species that had considered themselves safe observers were quietly reviewing their own defense budgets. The ambush at Venice Station happened on a Tuesday morning, Earth time. Diane's Phantom Division had been moving through a quiet sector on their way to support Aaron's main fleet when the Vrethkai trap closed around them. It was a good trap. Perfectly placed, perfectly timed, exactly the kind of thing Diane would have designed herself if she had been on the other side. The Phantom Division lost more than half its ships in 40 minutes. Diane survived. Barely. She was pulled out of a venting airlock by her crew and taken to the medical bay with 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a cut across the side of her face that would leave a thin scar. She lay in the medical bay for 2 days before Aaron was able to come and sit with her. He sat in the chair beside her bed for a while without saying anything. The room was quiet and the lights were low. Outside the small porthole, stars moved slowly past. She said, "Are we winning?" He said, "I do not know." She looked at the ceiling for a moment and said, "That is fine." He said, "It is." She said, "Good. Then help me sit up so I can look at a map." Back on Earth, Senator Cora Vance had been watching the casualty numbers for weeks, and she could not stay quiet any longer. She was a calm woman with a strong voice and a long career in politics, and she went in front of the cameras and made a clear, careful argument for pursuing ceasefire talks. She said that Earth had proven its strength and that negotiating from a position of demonstrated resistance was not weakness, it was strategy. She said that more people were dying every week and that at some point someone had to be willing to speak. A lot of people on Earth agreed with her. The debate was real and it was loud and it went on for weeks. Aaron respected Cora Vance. He said so publicly. But in private he told Leon Farrow that Earth could not enter negotiations while still fighting losing battles in 3 sectors. He said that if Earth negotiated now, every species in the galaxy would learn that humanity could be pushed until it asked to stop. He said that lesson would follow them for 100 years. Leon said, "I know. I agree. But you better make sure you are right." Aaron said, "I know." Dr. Nina Caswell had been running field medical operations across 12 active battle zones for the past 8 months. She had not slept in a real bed since month 3. She had developed a system for triaging wounded crew members in combat conditions that was faster and more effective than anything the fleet had used before, built partly from human medical training and partly from things she had learned studying alien physiology. 3 other galactic species quietly requested her protocols during month 10. She sent the files without asking anyone's permission. Aaron found out about it 2 days later from an intelligence report. He called her on the comm channel. He said, "I heard you shared our medical systems with 3 other species." She said, "Yes. Their people were dying from things we know how to fix. I did not think it required a committee." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good call. Keep doing your job." In his private logs, Zrath had stopped writing like a commander and started writing like someone trying to understand something that confused him deeply. He wrote about human persistence, about how a species that should have bent kept finding new ways to push back. He wrote that the Vrethkai had always believed that any enemy, given enough damage, would eventually stop. He wrote that he was no longer sure this was true for humans. He submitted a second report to the High Council. In it, for the first time in recorded Vrethkai military history, a sitting commander in an active war recommended reconsidering the conflict. The High Council was furious. They sent a fleet twice the size of anything Zrath had used before and told him to end it. They told him that the Vrethkai did not reconsider. They did not stop. They did not ask questions. They won. Zrath received the new ships and the new orders. He looked at them for a long time. Then he began planning the largest single strike the Vrethkai had launched in 200 years. On the Ardent, Aaron's sensor team picked up the fleet movements 3 days before the strike was scheduled. Aaron sat with the data for an hour. He did not call a crisis meeting. He did not raise his voice. He picked up the comm and called Diane in the medical bay. She answered on the second signal. Before he could speak, she said, I saw the sensor reports. Tell them to bring my uniform. He said, You are not cleared for active duty. She said, Then unclear me. He was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, There is a fleet briefing in 1 hour. The Battle of the Sunken Reach lasted 4 days, and it was not pretty. There was nothing elegant about how humanity fought it. Aaron had pulled together every ship still able to move, every pilot still able to fly, and every piece of equipment that could be made to work. He had mining vessels with welded-on gun plates. He had repair drones rewired to carry small explosives. He had fighter wings running on crews who had not slept properly in weeks and ships with hull patches that were not guaranteed to hold at high speed. What he also had was Diane Hollis, who showed up to the briefing with her arm in a partial brace and a look on her face that made 3 senior officers step slightly to the side when she walked past. She had reviewed all the Vrethkai fleet positioning data during the night and had written out an attack plan on 4 sheets of paper in handwriting that was messier than usual but completely clear. She said, We hit them from 7 directions at once. None of the angles make sense together. That is the point. Gary Elliott, who had come back from medical leave 2 days earlier against his doctor's direct instructions, raised his hand and said, I can take the north approach. It is the worst one. Bent Nail's specialty. Aaron looked at the room full of tired, scarred, determined people and said, We move in 6 hours. Nobody said they could not do it. That was the thing about them. After a year of this war, the idea that something was too hard had become almost funny. The Vrethkai fleet was enormous. It was the largest force Zrath had ever commanded, and when it arrived at the sunken reach it looked like a wall of dark metal against the stars. Zrath stood on the bridge and watched the sensor screens and waited for the human fleet to respond in some predictable way, because predictable responses were things he knew how to handle. What came instead was 7 simultaneous attack vectors that had no logical connection to each other. Mining vessels hit his left flank while fighter wings came up from below the orbital plane. A group of fast corvettes, which should have been covering the human rear, appeared directly in front of his command ship from a direction that required them to have traveled through a debris field at a speed that was technically inadvisable. A squad of repair drones began attaching themselves to the hulls of his outer ships and doing things with the hull plating that took his engineers several minutes to understand and counter. On the north approach, Gary and the Bent Nails did what they always did. They went in hard, took hits that would have stopped most crews, and kept moving anyway. Kevin Marsh, now a squad leader running a ground assault on a Vrethkai staging platform, led his team through 3 hours of close fighting in narrow corridors. When the platform's defensive systems finally failed and the Vrethkai garrison withdrew, Kevin sat down on the floor of the corridor with his back against the wall and just breathed for a while. One of his team members asked him if he was all right. He said yes. He said, I just need a minute and then we keep going. Nina Caswell ran her medical operations from a converted cargo bay on the edge of the engagement zone. She directed 3 separate teams across the battle, kept a running count of who was where and what they needed, and at one point personally stabilized a pilot who had been pulled from a venting cockpit with a punctured lung. She did it calmly, with steady hands, and when it was done she went back to the comm and kept coordinating. On Zratha's bridge, the sensor screens told a story he had never seen before. His fleet was not breaking the humans. His fleet was being pulled in too many directions at once, responding to threats that had no pattern, unable to form the solid lines that Vrethkai strategy required, because every time they formed a line something attacked it from a direction that had no strategic reason to exist. For the first time in his career, Zrath felt something he did not have a word for in his language. In the human records he had been reading, he thought it might be called being overwhelmed. Not by strength. By something else. By a kind of relentless, messy, completely unreasonable refusal to stop. He opened a direct channel to the Ardent. Aaron answered. He was standing at the sensor station with a coffee cup in one hand that had been empty for 2 hours. Zrath said, You are not what we thought you were. Aaron said, No. We are not. Zrath said, My council will not allow me to stop this engagement. They have given me direct orders to fight to the last ship. Aaron said nothing. He waited. Zrath was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I am going to contact the Galactic Council. The ceasefire request came through official channels 17 minutes later. In the Galactic Council chamber, the message arrived in the middle of a session and was read aloud by the council clerk in a flat, neutral voice. When the clerk finished reading, the chamber was completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was the first time in 4,000 years that the Vrethkai had asked for a ceasefire. The war ended the way most things end, not with a great moment but with exhaustion and paperwork and people putting down weapons slowly, like they were not quite sure it was real. Zrath was removed from command by the High Council for what they called unauthorized diplomatic contact. He did not seem to mind. He had already said what he needed to say. Aaron stood before the Galactic Council a week later to make a formal statement on behalf of Earth. He kept it short. He said that humanity had not wanted the war, that they had finished it, and that anyone who wanted to start another one with Earth should understand that they would finish that one too. He said the door was open for anyone who preferred talking. Leon Farrow, standing just behind him, added quietly, "We strongly prefer talking." Back on Earth, a reporter found Kevin Marsh at a small celebration event for returning soldiers and asked him what it had felt like to hold the relay station alone for 31 hours in the first weeks of the war, before anyone had known how long the fighting would go on. Kevin thought about it for a moment. He scratched the back of his neck. Then he said, "I was not really alone. There was a whole planet behind me. I just happened to be the one standing in that particular hallway." The reporter asked if he had been afraid. Kevin said, "Sure. But being afraid and stopping are two different things. Nobody told me to stop, so I did not stop." That is pretty much the whole story. Somewhere in the Galactic Archives, in the official record of the Oran Belt conflict, a clerk entered the final numbers and dates and territorial adjustments. At the top of the entry, because it was the first communication of the conflict and records required it, the original Vrethkai transmission was copied in as a header, unchanged. It read, "Congratulations. You have just warred humanity." Beneath it, in small plain text, someone had added a single word. "Indeed."